All right, welcome everybody to another session of Retirement Boot Camp's Dessert and a Movie. We are delighted to have you all here. We have a great crowd tonight, and a special welcome back to Kathy, and we're excited to have you here with us tonight as well. And my name is Kathleen Morgan. I am with the library, and I'm kind of your housekeeping person. So just a quick tutorial, because I think we have some new folks. We are recording the session, but really you don't appear in the recording unless you speak. So you can keep your camera off, or if you keep it on, really it's recorded in speaker view, which just shows the person speaking, as opposed to the gallery view, which is this Brady Bunch arrangement that at least what I'm seeing right now. If you want to switch up your view, up in the upper right corner of your screen that says view, if you click on that, you can choose speaker or gallery and kind of, decide which view you like the best. So the way this works, if you think of a question in the course of the conversation, there's a little speech bubble on your screen. Mine's at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, you can write your question in the chat, and Kathy and I will monitor those. And we probably at some point will make this super casual and allow you to unmute, and you can kind of talk, but we try to be mindful of each other and not talk over each other and all that kind of fun stuff. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Kathy, because we need to talk about desserts.
Yes, we do. Thanks, Kathleen. It's great to be back. It's great to see you all after a long time. Jack, as we all know, Jack, I'm not saying he likes to show off. He likes to share his talents with us. And this month he did something extraordinary. I want to know how many people took advantage of his offer to pick up dessert for tonight and sample it. Jack, would you unmute yourself and tell us about what you made? And it was delicious.
Was delicious. Wow.
I still got mine.
I know because I had it 2 nights ago. I couldn't wait.
I'm only kidding. It's a chocolate flourless cake, which is very chocolatey because you don't use flour, you use cocoa powder. So you're just eating a giant bite of chocolate. And then I covered it with chocolate ganache because you needed more chocolate.
Absolutely.
And just because I am a show off and I had them, I put some dried rose petals on it because the smell of the roses really goes nicely actually with chocolate. So that's what it is.
And is there a recipe you're willing to share with us for those who want it?
Absolutely. It's not really very difficult. It makes a really dense cake. It is obviously gluten-free because you don't use flour. I make it with some regularity for a friend of Maureen's who has a daughter who has celiac disease.
Mm-hmm.
So she doesn't get regular desserts, and it's sometimes hard to find them. So it's really simple, and I will put the recipe for the cake and the ganache to Kathleen, and she can pass it out to whoever.
Awesome, thank you. And before we get to our guest, who I'm really excited about having tonight, did anybody else make a different dessert they want to talk about before we move on?
I can talk about Aldi's chocolate bars.
Please do.
Has anybody bought these? They come in a pack of 5.
No, are they dark chocolate?
Dark chocolate.
Yeah.
It's Chocour, I think it's pronounced. It's French, but it's the German company Aldi. So I don't know why it's named French, but that's the way they do it. But yeah, you can break it off. I think there are 6 divisions. You can share it or however you want to. So I had some tonight.
I've had those, and they also make a milk chocolate with hazelnut.
Okay.
Nice. All these, I hear really good things. I don't get out there very often, but when I do, I come home with some really unusual new things. And so good to be reminded. Thank you. Okay, well, without further ado, Simran Sethi is here, and we were talking. She logged on about 15 minutes before we started tonight. I want to tell you, and I hope you don't mind, Simran, she had the booster shot yesterday. So this orange juice you see her chugging at this point is really her effort to energize herself for the next hour, and then she's going to hit the hay. She is coming to us from Washington, D.C. And I was telling her that she first came on my radar on the Oprah show. And I don't know, she's done, just hundreds and hundreds of things. And just her list of pieces of writing and audio on chocolate, Simran, that you sent us is amazing. She's got at least, oh God, I don't even know, 30 separate pieces of content writing podcasts on chocolate. So she is the get of this series. She is the chocolate lady, so to speak. But she's doing us a great favor tonight because she has had this booster so she can travel. And we want to respect your time and not exhaust you at the same time. But Simran is known as, well, an environmental reporter, right? First, I mean, that's kind of how you made your name, and you were on the Oprah show and while you were living in Lawrence, right? How did you come to Lawrence?
Well, I came to Lawrence for love. That relationship didn't pan out, but that's what got me to Lawrence, and I ended up staying actually. My partner at the time was going back to graduate school and was choosing between NYU and KU. And we were in New York, and I thought, well, if he moves to Kansas, like that's it, we're done. And then he showed up with a little a Jayhawk sticker and a Free State t-shirt and asked me if I would come with him. And I did, and I love Lawrence with all my heart. It's a delight to be with you all. I had the great privilege of teaching at KU. I was an associate professor in the School of Journalism. While I was doing, as Kathy was mentioning, a couple different things. I started off as a visiting chair at KU in the J School, but I was also the environmental reporter for NBC News and hosted a number of environmental programming type things, and then ended up leaving Lawrence in 2012 to work on my book, which was about the loss of agricultural biodiversity and food told through bread, wine, coffee, chocolate, and beer. It's available at the library. I've got library pride tonight. I'm here in my Lawrence library t-shirt. As informed as a vintage, so I love that. I miss the library, and yeah, all to say, I have been thinking about chocolate for a long time. I was a visiting scholar at the Cocoa Research Center in Trinidad and Tobago at the University of West Indies. I've studied chocolate making. I've studied sensory analysis of cocoa, so offering chocolate tastings, and pretty much everything you can think of around chocolate I've written about or talked about for publications like Food and Wine, the Washington Post, NPR. And then I also started a chocolate podcast. It was the first chocolate podcast, and it won an award for best food podcast by Savor magazine back in, I think it was maybe 2015 or 2017. One of those. Yeah, and I'm excited to talk to you about all things cacao and cocoa and chocolate today.
Yeah, and we will send you, I think we can send you, send everybody the PDF that you sent us with all of the things you've written about. I mean, literally all things chocolate. You cover all the bases here. And this is the book, which I did get from my library. Go figure. And you don't just talk about chocolate either. You talk about 5 other foods. Well, the title is Bread, Wine, Chocolate, the Slow Loss of Foods We Love, which sounds pretty depressing, but it reads like really a love letter to these 6 foods, right? Did you, I didn't finish it. Do you have octopus in there?
I do have octopus in there. You'll have to get to the end. You'll have to skip to the end, Kathy, to learn why.
Okay.
But that was a tag on at the end, and I got to come back to Lawrence and do a beautiful reading of the book up on campus, and then also I did a chocolate tasting at the Raven, and we did a hot chocolate event. Gosh, I don't remember when it was, but sometime after the book was out at the library. So chocolate and Lawrence are definitely the podcast was conceived in Lawrence. There's a lot there that's ties right into where you are right now.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk about the movie and what your opinion of the movie is, and your take on different aspects of the movie. But I thought it would be fun to start out and open the question up to everybody here, because the movie starts out, as I recall, talking about bulk chocolate and what I would call mainstream chocolate. And considering that most of us here are baby boomers or older, maybe a little younger, and I was just thinking of the chocolate that I experienced in my life growing up, which would definitely be considered bulk mainstream. That shot in the movie where they're showing the Easter candy, like the Easter chocolates and the chocolate eggs. And then I was thinking of what I considered chocolate and how, you don't expect a kid or a teenager even to have a sophisticated palate, but the offerings weren't there either, right? So this is the 60s, 70s, where we're talking about Hershey bars, and I think there was milk and bittersweet, right? I mean, maybe there was bittersweet or dark. But bittersweet, I didn't even come into my consciousness until I learned that the chips that go into the chocolate chip cookies were bittersweet, and then there was hot chocolate, which was Hershey's or Swiss Miss or Ovaltine. And I'm just wondering what you all can remember from, when you were a kid or a teenager, what kind of chocolate were you eating? And this where we thought was, real chocolate, because I thought this was a fascinating aspect of the movie. Does anybody have anything to contribute about that? Hershey's Kisses.
I remember
M&Ms.
Nestle Crackle bars.
Uh-huh.
Nestle Crackle bars.
And Snickers and Milky Way and Three Musketeers.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Actually, the Easter candy was like the delicacy,
Oh yeah. We waited
it's-
all year for that.
Absolutely.
Jack?
Man.
Oh, Scott?
I grew up in St. Louis, and of course I ate all of the Mars and all the normal candy bars that any kid would eat. But we were lucky, and I think most big cities had them. We had 2 or 3 really wonderful chocolatiers in town. And on those special occasions, or later on when I was a little older for that special girlfriend, I would go. Where I went was Mavracos. It was a Greek family, but they specialized in dark chocolate. We had Bissinger's, which was German, and we had, I'm not looking at you, I'm thinking, I'm sorry. And we had, what's one in South St. Louis? Merbs. And all 3 of them. So I was familiar with dark chocolate, but the sense of percentage of cacao or anything like that, I never experienced until, and I'm not sure I evolved or the world evolved into the world of foodieism, where people would say, oh, don't use 72%, use 81, whatever kind of experience.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
we did have really good chocolates and dark chocolates available to us. It wasn't, a nickel candy bar.
Yeah, we would get that in Kansas City. It was Russell Stover, because that company was Kansas City based. And
Right.
so if you would get your dark chocolate in a sampler, in a heart shape or at Christmas time. Did you have something to say?
I spent high school years in San Francisco area, and Ghirardelli chocolate was what we had, and I thought that was pretty special. I don't know how it actually rates these days against all these other chocolates that we saw in the movie, but at the time, Ghirardelli was really pretty good, especially on an ice cream sundae.
Yeah. Can't beat that.
Yeah.
Quite a few comments in the chat where Phil and Jill are giving a thumbs up to M&Ms and Kisses, and Kay is giving a shout out to Hershey bars. Scott said Russell Stover's was the fancy candy, especially the mint sticks they made for the campfire girls. I do
boy.
remember that. My dad would call the kid next door at 10 o'clock at night to buy a box of those. And then C's Candies on the West Coast. Again, Phil and Jill A lot of good
You
chocolate memories.
didn't try Andres on the plaza?
Oh, good point. They're like the real deal.
But they came along later.
Yes.
Nancy, didn't they come along much later? Or were they
They've been on
there?
the plaza since the 60s.
Really?
Yeah, they've been
Wow.
there a long
Yes.
time.
And I
And
don't
Dee-
want to brag, but I developed my taste for fine chocolate as a Girl Scout. At the age of 10, I went to Girl Scout camp, and one of our counselors was from Switzerland, and she
Oh.
brought chocolate bars for all the campers. And to this day, I still love Lind's chocolate the best.
Yeah,
All right. Well,
That's-
not to one up you, but Dee Boyd says, hello, Dee Boyd. My mother was born and raised in Belgium, so we had Belgian milk chocolate, which is very
Mm.
smooth. So
man.
yeah, that's good. And Corolla, I heard that you have made chocolate from cacao that you found where?
In Bolivia. We lived in Bolivia, my husband and I, for 5 years, and we purchased about 50 acres of land. And I think it wasn't until after we had purchased the land that we realized there was a cacao grove in the back of it.
Hmm.
And so we had our neighbors, native Bolivians, show us how to process it. And it was very rudimentary. We chopped it open with a machete, and you saw everything in the movie. It was exactly like they explained. And then we ground it, I think, with a meat grinder, and it was not smooth. It was okay tasting. And I guess I can say I've made chocolate, but it has not become a passion to make chocolate. I have enjoyed chocolate all my life. But that was a real nice experience to have the trees. They are very unique with the fruit growing on a stem.
You know, that's a really great segue into what I was going to ask Simran first. And I just will, with your permission, read a little bit, because this is really the first passage in the chocolate chapter, which made me feel so much better about myself for not having any idea what cacao looked like. And here's what she wrote. None of it was what I expected. Not the smell of damp earth, not the sight of scentless white blossoms the size of my fingernails, or pods the length of my forearm. Astonishing grooved footballs in green, yellow, orange, red, and purple, growing straight out of tree trunks. Not the sound of the pods thudding to the ground with a swift jab of palanca, a sharp blade on an extended wooden pole that stabs at the small expanse between the pod stem and trunk, or the sound of pods cracking open with the whoosh of a machete or hard strike against a tree, not the warm, sticky flesh. Were you that surprised, Simran, to see that that was how chocolate was grown?
Yes, in a word, because like everyone shared, I'd grown up with variations on what folks shared. I think Whitman's sampler was also something that factored in. My mother didn't really allow us to have chocolate at home, so we had carob introduced into the house from like the co-op, you know. But in any case, and she grew up in India, so Cadbury's was quite well known there. Fruit and nut bars were her favorite. But for me, realizing I'd had this great love of chocolate, it had been, you know, what I describe as my constant companion, my birthday cake, my wedding cake, it helped get me through my divorce. You know, it was this constant companion longer than any partner or job. And I couldn't recognize it in nature. And I was stunned that I knew so little about this agricultural product. You know, you think you've seen wheat, you know, you've seen images, we sing about wheat, you know, we know what corn looks like, a coffee bean, even when it's growing, looks like a bean. It's just light green instead of dark brown. So here I was looking for the chocolate, you know, as I go on to describe in the book, and I couldn't find it. And then when I realized it was these bumpy, you know, pods, I certainly didn't expect that I would still not find it, because when you crack them open, what you see, of course, as you saw in the film, is this sort of row of pulp covered seeds, and the seeds are acrid, they're lavender in color, mostly, like anywhere from like like a whitish color, a tan kind of white, to a light lavender color, and they're really bitter. So they're nothing like chocolate, and they get stuck in your teeth. So you actually, what you really enjoy in that moment is the pulp, that's the fruit that's around the seed. And then the seed has to be processed in order for it to approximate chocolate. So so it's a long journey, and yeah, it was quite humbling, and it was quite delightful, which is why I actually ended up writing so much about chocolate, because I was so stunned and delighted by the journey.
Well, and I was going to say, you really have. I mean, I'm looking again at the list of what you've written about chocolate, and you say of all the foods that you discuss in this book, the 6 foods, you've got bread, you've got wine, you've got coffee, you've got beer. Chocolate was the one for you. I mean, it was the most nuanced, it was complicated, and then you speak to that love, that just, I don't want to say addiction, but just that forever attraction to it, right?
Truly, I mean, we eat chocolate to make ourselves happy, to bring ourselves joy when we're sad. Chocolate, sales never abated during the pandemic, right? That didn't dip, as one example. So when people tighten their belts, they still try to make room, tighten their belts literally or financially. They still try to make room for a little chocolate. And it connects, when you were asking about people's memories, Kathy, the number of flavor compounds in cocoa, they're so rich, and there's so many. It's more complex than wine. And the way it gets processed, is through smell. It takes us all the way back, right? When we think about all these rich aromas that are available in chocolate, that smell, that the sensation of smell takes us all the way back to childhood. It's directly connected in the memory and in the brain to memory centers. So it's just a fascinating substance. And I think so many of us who grew up with Snickers or Twix, as I write about, or a Hershey bar, like, we're getting a very narrow swath of that, because industrialization, of course, would want that bar to be the same time and time again, not a surprise. But every harvest is different, every place is different. It's grown in a thin band around the equator, as you saw in the film, and every one of those places has a different flavor profile. And then even within a country, the flavors are different. So there's so much to discover.
Yeah, and speaking of places, you how long did you research this book? I mean, you were traveling for what, a few years?
Yeah, I spent a few years on crossing 6 continents, and I have tasted cacao on 3 continents. So I guess I've visited 3 continents. I've tasted cacao from, I guess, 4 or 5 continents. 4. So
Do you remember the first time you cut one open and tasted it? Was it just like in the movie where you just took it out, and what do you remember that experience and what your first impressions were?
absolutely, because it was so otherworldly, it felt like, I think I described in the book, it was like Dr. Seussian,
Yeah.
I just couldn't believe these weird looking fruits had, again, this like really luscious pulpy stuff in it. And then you were going to tell me that was going to turn into chocolate at some point. Like, it just, none of it made sense, and that's what made it so delightful.
Yeah. So how did you decide? You first went to a place called Esmeraldas, right? It's on the northernmost province of the Pacific coast of Ecuador. How did you decide to go there first?
So Ecuador is part of my book, is about going to the deep origins of the foods and drinks that you mentioned, and Ecuador and Peru are the centers of origin for cacao. So it's the place where cacao came into existence. And then we also talk about how it was domesticated, came into common usage in Mesoamerica. So Mexico definitely also has a claim. But yeah, it was my reason for going to Ecuador was to really get to, the source. And the quality of cacao, again, the diversity that I mentioned, is just, it's astonishing in Ecuador. And that's also a very familiar thing. The place where crop originates is often the place that holds the most diversity. And when you get that genetic diversity, you will also get diversity in flavor.
Mm-hmm. How long did you stay, and what were your living conditions like?
So the first time I went for 3 weeks, and then I went back, I think almost a year later for another 3 weeks. So 6 weeks in total. And I was traveling with people. So the accommodations, the first time I traveled with a chocolate maker from Cho Chocolate, TCHO, based in San Francisco, or maybe now in the Bay Area. And so I was traveling with them to a few places. We stayed in, very simple hotels. And then on that second trip, I did the same, but I was alone on that trip. So yeah, going on my own.
Yeah, well, I could talk all day about Brad, but so people haven't read the book, but I mean, that was a fascinating relationship and what Brad added to the conversation with, you'll just have to read the book, everybody. But I'm interested in, well, first of all, what did you think of the movie as a representation of what you probably already know?
Well, I have to confess, I didn't quite make it to the end of the film, and it's I apologize profusely because I haven't been feeling very well today. And also it's interesting because I know Mikkel Friesholm quite well. So hearing
really?
him speak, yeah, was lovely, but also to know him and to have sort of been in those environments, I may have been a little bit like, I know that stuff. But what I'd really love to know is like what everyone else thought. I'm so curious what surprised people.
Yeah, me too. That's what I was going to let you start and then see what so Mikkel was the Denmark guy. He was the maker from Denmark. Okay. So why don't we open up our unmute yourself if you like, if you want to, and let's weigh in on the movie and give it your review. And what did you like? What didn't you like?
It's like Maureen might have a comment.
Carola, I think.
I was just surprised about hearing a Japanese talk about it. I have never known Japanese being into chocolate. That was a surprise to me.
Okay. Who's next? Just, yeah, Maureen?
I think probably one of my favorite things was actually the design of the chocolate, their end products. Those were, I mean, I don't know how you could eat them. They were so wonderful. But I had a question. The pulp looked kind of good to me. I hesitate to say it, but I lean more toward vanilla than chocolate. And it looks so sweet and good that I wondered if they ever use stages of the cacao or byproducts, or if it's just strictly the chocolate.
Simran, do you know?
Well, I don't know if I understand the question. Do you mind sharing it again?
Well, when they were eating just the white part,
yeah,
it looked good, but they said it didn't really taste like finished chocolate.
Okay, so.
And I wondered, like, if I wanted it, is there any way to see what that tasted like? Is there any byproduct they sell?
So that white stuff is what we call white chocolate. In that list of articles that you'll get, there's a piece I wrote for the Washington Post called, I think it's called, Yes, White Chocolate is Chocolate. So, and it's cocoa butter. We call it white chocolate. It's just cocoa butter. Cocoa is a very fatty bean. And I'll use the words cacao and cocoa interchangeably. Usually what we'll say is that when it's on the tree, when it's in the pod, we'll call it cacao. Once it's been harvested, and then gone through the process of being, fermented and dried, then we sort of start to call it cocoa. But again, these are just semantics. It's a very fatty bean. That's why there's so much complexity in the aromas, in the smells, because a cocoa bean is about 70%, that's 70% fat. So what often happens is that cocoa butter, again, it's non-dairy, we just call it that, is expressed out, and it's used in beauty products. It's used for industrial purposes, or it's also used in white chocolate, but it's also, of course, used in dark and milk chocolate as well. It's just, it can be separated out and used in this other way. So any white chocolate bar that you see would be an example of that. To the point of it not tasting the same, it's interesting because I don't fully agree with that. There's some beautiful chocolate makers that really try to bring out the flavor notes of that cocoa. as opposed to putting vanilla on it. Vanilla will kind of dampen the flavor of lots of things. That's why people like to use it. It hides defects in a lot of baked goods and confections. But when it comes to cocoa, there is a very subtle cocoa note if it's kind of coaxed out. But what often happens is it's deodorized. That's the term that they use to create kind of a clean slate for whatever else someone, whatever manufacturer or chocolate maker wants to put into that bar.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Mary?
Well, thank you. You just answered all my questions. I was always told white chocolate is not chocolate. And so I'm so glad now that I can understand that. Tell me, what is Dutch processed cocoa?
Yeah, I don't know all the details around Dutch process, and we can do a Q&A for this whole time. I do know a lot of information, and I'm delighted to share, but I don't know everything. Dutch processing is an alkalization of the cocoa, and it makes it easier to bake with, but the exact process around it, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Don't worry, Simran, about that. That's who knew that chocolate was fermented? I mean, I'm just gonna call myself out as the idiot I am. I've been ordering brine, like from this fancy artisan pickle brine company, and now they tell me chocolate is fermented. Who knew? Did anyone else know that? I mean, it was fascinating. It was fascinating. Shelley.
I thought it was so interesting. I just feel so incredibly naive that I had no idea the chocolate came from this pod that grew right on the trunk of the tree from a flower, and then had all this beans and what's the other white stuff called?
The mucilage, like the pulp?
Yeah, the pulp.
Yeah.
And then that's how we end up getting, I mean, I really like chocolate. I have to be careful that I don't eat too much, but it's just like, wow, that's incredible. It just comes from that. And it's only grown in a very, small radius. It's like, I hope global warming never damages our chocolate growing. But I had no idea. It was amazing. They showed really in detail how that happened.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, Kay, because it was like one of these things, like watching this movie I never knew that. That, it was, and I've lived this long and I've never known that.
Right.
Which I guess
coffee is fermented too, Kathy, in case that was another one that really surprised me. Both coffee and cacao are fermented.
Yeah. I know, it was just that. Shelley, go ahead.
I was wondering, they didn't really explain, it's fermented and then it's roasted, but they didn't say how long it's roasted or low temperature, high temperature. How is it just like coffee, or is the point to stop the fermentation, or what's the point of the roasting?
Yeah. So the seeds are fermented and then they're dried and then they're roasted. And that will stop, the drying will stop the fermentation process. And the roasting profiles are actually, Mikkel is one of the leaders in sort of working with various fermentations. He likes to call himself a mad scientist. So he's always tweaking fermentation profiles, roasting profiles. They can be a variety of settings, but the idea is when cocoa is in the hands of a craft chocolate maker, the idea is that they are committed to bringing out the flavor notes that are in those particular cocos, as opposed to what I was talking about before around the uniformity, right? We want consistent Twix every time. We don't want to be surprised, but Mikkel wants to make sure that you're having, or Koyama, you're having a new flavor experience. And to the point of the earlier comment around Japan is a huge market for craft chocolate. Some of the makers, like one of the biggest makers, craft chocolate makers here in the United States, based in San Francisco, Dandelion, their second store, after their store in San Francisco, the second store that they opened in the world was in Tokyo. So a market that really has great appreciation for kind of those nuanced flavors.
Yeah. The Behringers bring up a point that was also in my notes, the huge amount of manual labor that goes into the various stages was eye-opening. I was particularly struck by, how the cacao farmers don't want their children to become cacao farmers. And by the difference between the bulk chocolate makers and that the speculating, it's like wheat, like you take it to market, you see what kind of price you can get, and it's out of your hands, whereas the craft chocolate cacao people can set their price, right? And that was interesting to me, but they still get the short end of the stick.
Without question. And that's the
Yeah.
part that I think is often it's always fun to talk about makers, but that's what I appreciate so much about this film. And the strongest stories that I feel I've written are really about shedding light on farmers. That's the part I love to I love to eat chocolate, but what I'm most passionate about in my work is shedding a light on farmers. And the reality is that 70% of the world's cocoa is grown in West Africa, and child laborers as young as 5 years old work in conditions that are called hazardous, but I would call tantamount to enslavement. And Terry Collingsworth is a lawyer who's been fighting on behalf of enslaved children who are now adults and have never gotten their due. And one case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The court ruled in favor of the chocolate manufacturers, but when you read the court case, if you would indulge me, I'd love to just read a little bit to you. I don't want to be too much of a downer here, but are you okay with me sharing something about their experience?
Absolutely. And Scott Morgan just asked a question pertaining to West Africa, so this is timely. Scott, feel free to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah. Should I read first, or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Question. Okay, I'll read first. This is according to the lawsuit that was filed last summer, and it made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Workers allege that when they were between the ages of 12 and 14, they were trafficked from their home country, which was Mali, and enslaved on cocoa plantations in Ivory Coast. And this is directly from their lawsuit, which was against Nestle. Respondents were forced to work on Ivorian cocoa farms for 12 to 14 hours per day, at least six days per week. They were not paid and were given only scraps of food to eat. Respondents were beaten with whips and tree branches when their overseers felt that they were not working quickly enough. They were forced to sleep on dirt floors in small locked shacks with other children, and were guarded by men with guns to prevent them from escaping. Respondents witnessed other children who tried to flee the plantation being severely beaten and tortured. One respondent, John Doe 4, tried to escape, and when the overseers caught him, they cut the bottoms of his feet and rubbed chili pepper into his wounds. He was also tied to a tree and beaten until his arm was permanently damaged. John Doe 3 witnessed small children who tried to escape being forced to drink urine. John Doe 6 was severely beaten for working too slowly when he was sick. And it goes on and on and on. Multiple scars from the machete cuts, being forced to use those tools, being exposed to hazardous chemicals like pesticides and herbicides. This is the reality of cocoa now. And, we'd like to think that this shouldn't exist anymore, but the truth of the matter is that these rates have not gone down despite everything that the cocoa industry has been promising, that they've been doing from 2005, the deadlines they set. Now they're pushing to 2025. And the rates in the interim are going up.
Did you say that was Nestle?
That particular suit was Nestle.
And do you know the status of that suit now?
The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Nestle, but the reason they ruled in favor of Nestle, I want to make clear, wasn't because they didn't say that there was child slavery in their cocoa supply chain, but because it didn't violate a particular suit, which was the ATS. It was the particular trafficking law that it was under. The Alien Tort Statute is what it's called. So you can read about this in the list. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but I just want to say that was not a way of saying that Nestle wasn't culpable. And even if you read their own reporting, their own sustainability reports, whatever they call them, they will admit to the fact that there's child slavery in their supply chain. But the efforts that they and Hershey's and Cargill and all these companies have made has been so slow Then on the one hand, they want to tell you they can trace all their cocoa, and on the other hand, they want to tell you they can't find all these kids, and it just gets really messy. And the impacts that they're having, I think, are minimal at best. Yeah.
Well,
The
Scott's
impacts
question was,
against child slavery are minimal at best. Yeah.
Scott's question was about West Africa, and he wondered if that area entirely, is that area entirely industrial production? So predominantly?
Predominantly, not exclusively, especially in Ghana. There's some really lovely, and it's in one of the things I've written, there's some lovely craft chocolate makers popping up in Ghana, as well as craft chocolate makers in the United States and all over using Ghanaian cocoa. It's considered the standard. So this chocolatey brownie kind of note that we find in cocoa, that's the taste of Ghana. And for those of you who haven't had craft chocolate, you might not be like, what is she talking about? But when you sort of start to get into the substance, there's a host of flavors that can be revealed. A tartness, a sourness, nuttiness. These are all found just in Ecuador alone. Really subtle floral notes. There's all kinds of things there if you have the opportunity to discover them.
When you talk about the farmers, one of the things that struck me in the film was the idea that not only should the makers visit the farmers, right? And I think in Lawrence anyway, I know there's a big push to, like, the chefs will go and visit the farmers. There are a lot of restaurants in town that buy from these smaller farms, and they will go to the farms, and they've made an effort in the last, say, 4 to 5 years to do that. But the film also said the farmers should taste the products of the makers to find out what their produce tastes like and looks like, and the whole experience of sampling that end product. And I don't know that happens on that end that much. Do you? I don't know that the farmer in Lawrence, for instance, we went to 715 a couple of months ago, sat outside, and I just had this tomato salad with these just gorgeous, delicious heirloom tomatoes. And the chef had dressed it up and done some stuff. And I asked, where are these tomatoes from? I went to the market the next day and I told them, I just had your tomatoes in this salad. And the guy who sold it to me had no idea what I was talking about. He hadn't tasted that, what that chef did with his tomatoes. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. It changes. Part of my book, I chart actually going with Cho Chocolate. They were creating flavor labs, small, modest kind of setups that would allow farmers to taste the end product. Because if you have no understanding of kind of what they're making it into, it's really hard to get the kind of flavor profile that a craft chocolate maker would want, right? So maybe they want more fermentation or less fermentation. Like, these are all things that you start to learn intuitively. So it would be like someone growing grapes for wine and never tasting the wine. Like, you develop a much more intimate relationship with it. Or if you're baking and you never taste that flourless chocolate torte, that you would have only, your knowledge could only go so far. And that, the goal there is to really help farmers be able to command a higher price, because the majority of cocoa farmers all over the world earn, like something like $1 a day or $1.15 a day. They live in extreme poverty. That's the industrial side. And even the craft market has grown exponentially, but it's still very small. So it's hard. It's so hard for farmers to make a living. That's why you hear, like, people don't want their kids doing this, and that happened. That was echoed to me with the wheat farmer I interviewed in India. He did not want to be there. He saw how hard his father worked on the farm, and everything Kathy you were saying about the volatility of the price, the futures market completely disrupts, like, what will someone be paid for all of their labor and time, and that's a really hard way to make a living. So yeah.
And just knowing that cuts into the pleasure of, let's face it, not everyone can afford a craft chocolate, a Christopher Elbow truffle, or even the bars of fair trade chocolate at the Merc. Not everyone can pay $4 for a bar of chocolate. Right. And knowing that so little of that price gets to the farmer.
Yeah.
is
think-
really deflating. Yeah.
I
It
think
is
for
deflating. I
Gracie-
think 3 to 5% of the cost of a chocolate bar goes back to the farmer. And I could be wrong about that. That might be outdated at this point, but I do want to say one thing, because that is often used as sort of the like, well, what are we supposed to do? Like affordability. And, you know, this was something that was said to me in the book, but you know, well, actually I can quote something more immediate. When those kids who are now adults lost that suit, you know, I interviewed them and they talked to me about, you know, the description that they use. They're from Mali, you know, was like, you're eating my flesh. And it really struck me that like, if we as a society don't start to make a different set of decisions, these problems won't go away, because Hershey wants to keep their bar as cheap as possible. There used to be in the 80s, there was more money going to farmers. I think it was closer to 10 to 15%. That has dropped. Meanwhile, sales have skyrocketed. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations, you know. When the price of cocoa a couple of years ago dropped by 30%, the market price for cocoa, people couldn't feed themselves. They couldn't, nothing in Ivory Coast and Ghana. Did the price of our chocolate bars drop by 30%? Absolutely not. That was a windfall for corporations. And so, you know, I would recommend anybody who's interested to think about buying fewer bars. And I know that sounds like not fun, but there is so much in that small bar. I can't even tell you, like the difference between just downing I don't know, I'll go with Twix again, versus like having one of these craft bars. It's like the difference between PBR and, you know, something from Free State. Like you're going to want to spend a little bit more time with it. You're going to want to explore a little bit and get curious. And if I may, like there's a question from Ellen in the chat about, is there a company or companies that are better to buy from? The number one company that comes to mind for me is very close to Lawrence in Missouri. It's Askinosie chocolate. I am a big fan of Askinosie because the bars taste amazing. And then also because Sean not only goes to Origins and is very committed to working with farmers, all his books are open so they know exactly how much everything costs. And he actually asks the farmers what they would like to be paid. A lot of companies, and I think Freeze Home might be actually one of them. I don't know about Koyama. What they'll do is they'll pay X percentage above the commodity price. But when the commodity price is down here and you're paying 10% more, it may not be doing that much to help the farmers. It's the same thing actually goes for certifications. Certifications are a great floor. It's a great thing to look for, but they're not perfect. There's still a lot of work to do. But anyhow, craft chocolate makers, there's a list. If you look in some of my articles, you'll see a list of people. Anybody that I put on my podcast or in frankly any of my reporting are companies that I stand by and know are really doing everything they can to make sure that farmers are paid a fair price.
And the first one you mentioned is Askinosie. Can you spell that for me, please?
Yeah, I'll put it right here in the chat.
Put it in the chat. Yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
And I think
Springfield.
Gracie had a comment. She was waving her hand.
Oh, Gracie, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to mention that, yeah, there's definitely a disconnect between the farmer and the producer with, they showed them giving them a sample of the chocolate, but they're not actually visiting into the store. And then later it flashed to Europe where they showed the full candy bar that was processed and packaged. And somebody maybe can tell me, but it had a price tag of 34,00. What is that, euros, or what is that price for one chocolate bar?
Yeah. Where was it in Europe? It's probably, yeah, they use like, instead of a decimal point, they use like a comma.
Yeah. But I don't know if it's euros or.
It wouldn't be euros. 34 euros would be a lot. It could be not pounds. It wouldn't be 34 pounds or 34 euros.
It was the chocolate bars that were the gentleman that was from Europe.
The Denmark, the guy from Denmark.
Yeah, from Denmark. So it was Denmark. I don't know what.
Are they still using the kroner?
I think, do they use kroners in Denmark?
Yeah.
They're not on the euro system. Yeah.
So what would 34 be for one bar?
Oh, we have to Google.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that's,
I'm on it.
I'm thinking
good.
that's like $20 or something like that.
Yeah.
I think.
But but they don't want the farmers to see the price that we're paying and compare it to what they're
Well-
receiving for their own chocolate or cacao.
Right. I mean, that's why I value Sean for so much, Sean Eskinosi, for having open books. So everyone knows exactly, everyone, the farmer, as well as the maker, are in direct communication about that. And that opacity that you're talking about, that price that's paid for cacao, because cacao can't be fermented in small batches, it needs scale to ferment properly. So a lot of small farmers will just bring small amounts of cacao to a central fermentary, and they'll get whatever that middleman price is. And that's that's a juncture that's really exploitative, because they don't have any information. It's a really imperfect system.
Okay, so 34 is the equivalent of $4.55,
Sounds right.
according to the
All right.
Google.
Yeah.
If Google is their currency calculator.
And I don't know if you've seen Mickle's bars. They're like half, maybe 2/3 of an iPhone, 2/3, and then like 1/3 down. So they're mini bars. They're not like what we think of as a chocolate bar. They're a little bit smaller.
Jack,
Yeah,
5
I'm not
minutes.
sure if they have it. I know it's been halted because of COVID, and I assume hopefully they'll go back. But we were lucky enough to go to Topeka to the chocolate festival they have there. And I believe the manufacturer she was just mentioning was there, along with many others of a variety of range. But we got the chance to taste not only percentages, but but really good makers, and really get the sense, and have people there, it was like a wine tasting, trying to explain to me what I was tasting. I'm not really good at that, but it was phenomenal. And if they started again, that's a really great local opportunity to get to the level that, Simran's talking about, and seeing what you're paying for. If you're paying $4.50 for a bar instead of $1.25 or whatever it is. And I thought it was really, really well done. The other thing is Christopher Elbow in Kansas, and I'm not sure if it's quite on the same level, but in Kansas City, in his store, he does have drinking chocolate, which is a whole nother story about chocolate. But that's an experience that is so unlike drinking hot chocolate, the bitterness and the purity of the chocolate. And it's really a pretty phenomenal thing. But that's a good experience that you can have here in Kansas City, as well as Andre's, obviously. That's really good.
Yeah, I was interested in that scene. It was towards the end of the movie where Susumu was doing a kind of a final tasting, maybe with his, I don't know whether it was with a buyer or maybe his quality control guy or something, but they had them numbered. They were just doing this kind of very methodical tasting. And I wondered, when people sample chocolates like that, Simran, do you know, is it kind of like a wine tasting where you start with the lighter wines and work to the big mouthfeel, or the big reds? Do they do it like that?
It's interesting. There's a debate about this, because one thing that happens, so you would separate out something like milk as a different kind of tasting protocol, because milk, so just so you know, it's not made with liquid, it's milk powder, it's milk solids, but it will really stay in the mouth, and tends to be a higher sugar content, not only because of the milk, but because of actual sugar, or whatever sweeteners used. So oftentimes people will start with the highest percentage. All percentage means, I'm not sure if this was covered. You can read this in the chocolate tasting guide that's also in that PDF, but it tells you the percentage of cocoa and then what's left over for everything else. So if it's 80% cocoa, you got 20% for your nuts, your sugar, whatever it is. If it's 50%, then you've got 50% left. A traditional candy bar is 10 to 11% cocoa. So that's not really a chocolate bar. And you're not going to ever get that kind of those flavor notes. It's like a venti, like, I don't know, Frappuccino from Starbucks versus like a beautiful, like, single origin from Repetition. Like, those are not the same thing. And that's what the price difference is going to reveal that as well. There's a lot more work and care that goes into these more, these more refined craft bars.
Yeah. Well, we promised Simran that we would do a hard stop at 8 o'clock so that she can go sleep
Okay.
off her vaccine. She's in DC, by the way, and it's later there. So we can't thank you enough for coming. And I wanted, the book again is Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love, by Simran Sethi. And thank you so much for joining us
Thank you all
tonight.
for
Yes, we can all.
Yes,
me.
thank
So
you very
delightful.
much.
And thank you. I'm so excited that, I had a first timer here on Zoom. That's an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And listen, Shelley, I'll quickly answer your question. How different are the cocoa varieties? They're very different. Thank you, Nancy. They're very different. They can really, if you're in Papua New Guinea where I was, they dry a lot of cocoa over fire, or they use that to power the dryer. So there's a smoky kind of element there. When you're in Ecuador, you're going to get these gorgeous raisin notes. One of my favorites is Madagascar. That's really known for like a Granny Smith apple kind of, there's a tartness there. And it's subtle, right? When you start getting intimate with it, then you start to notice it more, but you have to pay attention. It's not hard. And that book that, Kathy shared, there's a tasting guide there for you for all the substances I cover. And then there's also in the back, there's a flavor wheel. That's what experts, I interviewed 200 people for my book, on 5 continents. And what they all said is like, there's 3 things. It's, it's being comfortable, like recalling what you're smelling. So it might be like Oreo, jasmine, whatever it is, like being courageous and sharing it, having like a big palate to try everything, whether you like it or not. We don't use those terms when we're tasting. We just know that we're learning something from it. And then also being able to, to really name it in the moment, right? So that's where sometimes it gets hard to say, like, is this vegetal? Is it grassy? Is it cherry? What is it? And that's where all these kinds of wheels come in handy. So yeah, I encourage you all to explore. Let this be the first part of your chocolate exploration. And I am so excited for all of you. And it's been a delight to be here with you this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much.
you.
And who wishes they save Jack's chocolate for the end? I do.
Sorry, it's gone.
I'm really craving it now.
Oh my
Simran,
gosh.
that's thanks to you. Thank
Thank
very
you.
much.
Well, you're welcome, Kathy.
Go to
And
bed.
Jack, I'll be in
Go to
Lawrence
bed.
sometime soon. I hope that I'll get a chance to try some of your beautiful cakes.
Come
Yeah.
to the library. All right. Thank you. Go to
All right,
bed.
thanks so
You're
much.
dismissed.
Good night.
Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. Good to
you.
see everyone.